Hey, hello, everyone. My name is Plum Ertz. I'm a senior engineering manager at Rowe, based out of New York City, and I'm here today with Jack, an engineering manager at BuzzFeed, based out of London. Together, we spearheaded BuzzFeed's accessibility project. Spoiler alert, the site did receive a letter of conformance from a third-party auditor. But if this were a really easy or straightforward process, we wouldn't be here today to talk about it, and honestly, we probably wouldn't have half of this conference as a whole. This is a presentation that didn't even really come from the adage of hindsight is 2020. We knew a lot of times, even midway through what we were doing, we had made mistakes we couldn't really recover from or course correct once we had gone down a certain path. But now that we've reached this kind of milestone and reached the end of one chapter of the story, we can summarize the lessons in communication, logistics, and most importantly, bravery that we learned for the next go around, because accessibility is never a one and done.
Hey, this is Jack taking over. We are going to be taking you through this journey in a mostly chronological order, so we'll be referring to this timeline as we go. And the timeline itself is our very first lesson. We didn't build accessibility in from the very beginning. When I joined the company in 2017, there were already engineers and designers there who were interested in improving accessibility. There were designers who made an effort on color contrast in their own designs. There were engineers who tried to make sure that the UIs they built all followed the best practices. However, those were isolated individuals. To my knowledge, there had never been any holistic project or commitment to make the site accessible to everybody. And that was perfectly common for the time. BuzzFeed was founded in 2006. 12 years later, in 2018, we contracted an external accessibility auditor and made the commitment to fix it all. You'll see soon how much work 12 years of building without accessibility in mind created. Imagine if we'd done this from the start. So, to reiterate, in an ideal world, we'd have started building accessibly in the very beginning in 2016. We actually started in 2018. So we came in about 12 years later than we should have. Our next mistake. We didn't set ourselves up for a good partnership with our accessibility auditors off the bat. So from 2006 to 2018, we never made a major push to improve accessibility on BuzzFeed.com. What changed? There were always engineers and designers interested in accessibility and who tried to positively influence things at a local level, but that never created a moment of critical mass. What kicked this off in the end was a series of lawsuits that used the Americans with Disabilities Act in what was a new way at the time, suing retailers and publishers for the lack of accessibility in their websites. As we got fond of saying, nothing kicks off a project like the threat of a lawsuit. Our desire to avoid the risk of legal action meant we could justify finding paid external accessibility experts who were going to help audit our website, recommend fixes, and accredit us once we'd fixed everything. That's great. That kicked off everything that followed into motion. But there is a problem. This began as a project about legal compliance, about accreditation. Yes, everybody wants to do the right thing, but the thing that actually got us moving was the legal department. Our accessibility partner's first point of contact was a lawyer and an executive member of the tech team. By the end of the project, they were speaking to Plum, who was marshalling batches of fixes to be reviewed and coordinating with their QA team to schedule reviews. Sticky issues that we struggled to fix were also handled in the one-to-one relationship that Plum built with our account manager. In the end, the productive part of the relationship was where we got the people making the fixes as close as possible to the experts, once all the legal and financial discussions were out of the way. So in retrospect, perhaps it's pragmatic to assume that what kicks off an expensive investment in improvement like this is a business consideration. But what would have been better would have been to get the people making the fixes closer to the experts as early as possible. The mistake. We got leadership buy-in, but not really. Leadership gave us a mandate. They wanted us to fix accessibility on BuzzFeed.com and get the fact that it was fixed independently verified by experts. We had the money in place to contract those experts. We had the understanding that this was going to take a while. And that's pretty much buy-in, right? Or kind of. When we kicked off the project, we gave our auditors a collection of URLs to check over and left them to it for a few weeks. While they did that, we didn't feel like we could do much proactively in the meantime. We started thinking about how to deal with the fixes and problems that were going to come back. We had a gut feeling that the number of issues to solve was going to be big. but we hadn't seen the full scale of it yet. So how could we know how much resource to dedicate to the remediation effort? At BuzzFeed, we tend to shuffle or tweak the teams in tech around the business's goals once or twice a year. Forming teams and apportioning resources is one of the most difficult things to do in a large engineering organization. We knew a bunch of work was probably going to land sooner or later, but we couldn't prove how much. And there were other business critical priorities to work on that were sure things. So we decided to punt on trying to get resource to fix stuff until we saw the report. We felt like we weren't going to get an accessibility team that was just made for that reason. And there were strong arguments to spread the accessibility work across all the relevant feature teams, which I will discuss in a minute. And so we waited. This lesson in bravery is brought to you by getting loads of work and having nobody to do it. So when the report came back, the inevitable happened. We were looking at hundreds and hundreds of issues, ranging from the easy fixes to the severe systemic problems. We had no accessibility team beyond us two, and it was time for us to start getting the work done. The model we chose was not to build an accessibility team with enough engineers to solve all the problems. Instead, we started to divide and conquer. We, me and Plum, started to comb through all the issues and try to slot as many as we could into the scope of existing teams based on their responsibility for different areas of the website. The plan was that most of the work would fit into these neat existing teams, and only a little bit of it would be in areas of the site considered legacy or in maintenance mode. However, a lot of the work, most of it could not be slotted anywhere. It fell into an all-purpose etc. bucket. That catch-all bucket would be slowly worked through by the last resort, a one engineer team comprised of engineers from the other teams rotated through for a week at a time. If we had known how much work would slip through the cracks of existing teams, I'm sure we wouldn't have planned it this way. The lesson within the lesson here is that for a website of sufficient size, a huge proportion of it isn't being worked on by anyone and might not even be owned by any particular team right now. Those arguments for spreading the work across multiple teams I mentioned earlier, they're good arguments. By spreading the work throughout the relevant teams, you force the whole organization to learn the skills and knowledge necessary to make features accessible now and for future products. You also make teams reckon with the accessibility requirements of their own products, and it helps enforce the idea that accessibility is just another crucial part of the product development process. It isn't fixed off stage by somebody else. However, what we found in reality was that there was a huge chunk of issues that fell between the cracks of different teams' responsibilities, and another set of issues that were so wide-reaching that the responsibility was collective. Take alt text, for example. We didn't have a team that was actively working on the images rendering in all their different forms in articles or across all the feeds. We didn't have a team working on all the databases and APIs that store and return images that need a new alt text field. We did have a team working on the CMS where we would also have to get alt text added, but who's responsible for delivering alt text for our users overall? It's either nobody or it's us two. Our next lesson in logistics came after we made the mistake of manually importing everything into Jira. If you recall, our auditors returned a lot of issues, like 400 issues. Our third-party provider has their own issue tracking dashboard where we could go back and forth with their experts on issues, mark them as being worked on, and they could mark them as verified or rejected, and so on. BuzzFeed uses Jira internally to track work, so we had a choice in front of us of how to marry the two systems together. Maybe if we'd been an off-the-side accessibility team, that we wouldn't have bothered trying to work on this so much, but we could have just used their issue tracker and reported back top-level progress to our own organization within tech. However, as previously discussed, we really distributed the work into existing teams, or tried. We made an ideological decision that the work to fix accessibility on the site was the same as any other work. For that reason, the issues and their tracker had to be digestible in the same way as any other work moving through the team Jira boards was. So we, or rather Plum, embarked on the task of exporting everything from the third-party issue tracker into Jira. The task was a long and arduous one that was only partially automatable. What wasn't at all automatable was keeping the two systems in sync with one another. Every time a piece of work was completed and ready for review, Plum would have to manually update its status in the third-party tracker. Every time we wanted to batch up a series of fixes to be reviewed by the auditor, Plum spent a couple of hours in Jira and the issue tracker getting all the states lined up. If we did this over and we were still spreading the work out as much as we did, We probably make sure we included in the contract with the auditor some kind of migration help or API access to more easily sync our issue tracker with theirs. This lesson in communication came after we asked a lot of unprepared people to do a lot of stuff. The report from our third-party auditor landed on the 10th of January, 2019. Our plan was to get the work divided up based on how everybody was already organized. We took stock of the product development teams that we had in tech and their areas of scope and what their responsibilities were. Then we slotted the accessibility tickets into their roadmaps. While, as discussed, much of the work fell in between the gaps between these teams' responsibilities, we felt good that the work was spread across so many teams that each would have the chance to learn how to address accessibility issues. To help them come up to speed, we wrote out a guide for each team that explained the main issues in their areas and how that broke down into tickets. Within tech, the ads team got a bunch of issues about ads creating focus traps with explanatory notes. The tasty team got the tasks to fix their site nav and so on. That sounded great to us at the time, this divide and conquer approach. We were mostly thinking about how to tackle one large lump sum of work and how to avoid disrupting our team's roadmaps before it was totally necessary. The downside is that by the time we turned up with a chunk of work for them, the teams had very little preparation. The PMs knew that some kind of accessibility work was probably coming. The engineers who already knew how to tackle accessibility fixes were somewhat ready, but the ones who hadn't been given any training ahead of time. All in all, we asked a lot of unprepared people to do a lot of stuff. What we could have done was front load some of that accessibility training with engineers, bring our product managers into the process earlier before we started shoveling Jira cards into their boards. Muhammad Ali said that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. On the 23rd of January, 13 days after our report arrived, BuzzFeed announced that it was laying off 15% of its workforce. Some of those teams we've been preparing work for rolled up entirely. Others lost their accessibility champion. Roadmaps for the existing teams were changed, sometimes radically. Layoffs in the media sector aren't rare, and while they are dreadful, they shouldn't come as a total surprise. Given the long view this accessibility project took, perhaps we should have planned for such an event. Was our organizational solution too wedded to the teams and priorities in tech as they existed in one moment in time? Probably.
All right, Plum taking over a bit of the timeline here. So without going into too much detail, the organization behind the layoffs was very scattered. If you've ever been at any sort of company with major layoffs or reorganizations, you've experienced the fact that everything is not business as usual the next day, the next week, even the next month. And it was no different in our situation at BuzzFeed. In this kind of weird way, the layoff period, which was from around January to March of 2019, was productive for the accessibility initiative, because while teams were kind of thrown off base and we were trying to figure out the overall path forward, a lot of the folks who remained were just looking for things to do, things to feel productive, to feel good. And I just had like this cool, huge backlog of a few hundred Jira tickets ripe for the taking. Our mistake here, though, was in not pushing this further. We had interest, we had some time. We really could have and should have had this key point where we brought the momentum to leadership and said, hey, let's keep going. Here's the work, here's the team, let's scope it and make this something more formal. But we didn't. We just kind of picked through issues while we were waiting for this bigger plan to kind of descend from above instead of really making ourselves a part of it. We were too passive, which is why we see the meh face in this part of the timeline. We were waiting to see what would happen versus trying to guide it. And honestly, the worst we could have been told was no, but we didn't make the effort, so we'd never get the answer. We assumed new teams would form and we'd go through the reassignment exercise we had literally just gone through and carry on from there. And you might be thinking, oh, that's media, that's BuzzFeed, my team's different, my team's more stable, it'll be fully funded. But you have to remember that accessibility can't speak for itself, regardless of what your organization is set up like. You have to be the voice continuing to push and speak for accessibility. You need to be in the room when people are strategizing and prioritizing to make sure accessibility remains a priority. So let's talk about prioritization. One of the biggest mistakes we made in terms of prioritization was telling the accessibility story in terms of dollars rather than sense, like common sense. When you think about prioritization, the things that come to mind are value to the company and overall opportunity size, the key arguments to push an initiative forward in general. Especially after a period of layoffs or sort of turmoil, it's natural to really want to demonstrate value, to show quick wins, highly visible things, to say, hey, look, we're doing well, which makes it really, really hard to make a case for accessibility. It's a long-term investment and not a quick win. At this point in time at BuzzFeed, when we were thinking about KPIs and business level metrics, we were thinking about page views per session. So the amount of content that in a single time sitting on BuzzFeed, someone would consume. And that's a really, really hard metric to move with traditional means, with traditional products, with making changes to the site that are highly visible, highly interactive. And when we're trying to make the case for accessibility, it's going to be really difficult to have it be something that's that highly visible. 100% of our leadership were folks who did not require assistive technologies, who would not see the benefits of accessibility up front. And the problem with all of this thinking of framing accessibility as a feature is, as I've said before, it's not a feature, it's a foundation. It's something that we need to do and we need to put into everything that we do. Treating it as a feature was kind of the knee-jerk reaction to the situation at the time. In retrospect, there are two different ways we could have approached this. If we wanted to keep the narrative of accessibility as a feature, to continue to engage in that sort of prioritization and opportunity size discourse, we could have focused potentially on the most inaccessible experiences on the site at the time, which were our quizzes. Our quizzes represented a huge volume of traffic, which is great for running A/B tests. And our quizzes had a lot of accessibility and interactivity problems, text baked into images, keyboard accessibility, markup was not semantic or in a proper hierarchy at all. If there was any place on the internet at the time where we could have maybe run a traditional A/B test between an accessible and an inaccessible experience and potentially seen some sort of result, it would have been quizzes. But we never took that chance and we never really tried. I kind of kick myself for that only because it's a really rare opportunity to provide that kind of traditional business metric around accessibility. But the second kind of better option in this space would have been to look at the costs over time of doing this accessibility work as such a piecemeal project versus having it as a dedicated task force. The engineering time ends up being about the same, but the real difference in cost comes from the overhead of continuing to manage the project. Jack mentioned I spent a good deal of my time in Jira, and I did. And on top of that, we also had to work with our third-party auditors who charged by the hour. And they charged us by the hour, regardless of if we sent them 5 minutes of work or 50 minutes of work. So when we're doing these sort of piecemeal, rolling, validating tickets as we go, we're burning down a lot of our budget without actually making a lot of progress on making the site more accessible. And we ended up having to extend our contract and get additional funding to be able to complete the project in its entirety because of this manner of approaching it. And I think if we had done it more consolidated, it actually could have been a cheaper project overall. But as I said, we did neither of those things. We kind of kept it as this piecemeal project. And so the period from around March of 2019 to almost November of 2019 is kind of the turtle period of the project. We were moving really slowly. Oddly enough, after all of that hesitation to take on accessibility as a foundational project, our next big project was a foundational project. We took on a replatforming of one of our core article services in the name of both performance and SEO in general. This ended up actually being a way to sort of be the Trojan horse for accessibility because we got our dream project. We could build from the ground up. We could put in all the tests. We could put in all the linters. We could put in all the semantic markup that we wanted. But all of this cool new code was sitting in production behind a feature flag where it would sit for the next 11-ish months. It was a replatforming. Replatforming takes time. And this means that while we're doing all this stuff and making ourselves feel good as developers, we aren't getting those changes out there and we aren't really helping our audience. We're also, because we're biased on fixing all this new stuff, leaving a lot of legacy code that in the end is still going to have to be updated even after this refresh launches behind. And this ties back, the next lesson here ties back to what Jack had mentioned earlier about when we were trying to bucket issues, we found a lot of stuff that fell through the gaps. And here's what happens with all the stuff that falls through the gaps. We avoided it for a very long time. We avoided legacy code because we were too concerned about asking for permission instead of forgiveness. We needed to make some changes that would impact the site in slightly visible ways or ways that were big enough we wanted to try and get stakeholder buy-in. Things like changing the way that motion appears. BuzzFeed uses a lot of GIFs, and we wanted to change some of the pieces around that. And we also wanted to remove infinite scrolling from pages and replace it with pagination. But when you're in an organization with 600 plus microservices, not an exaggeration, it can be tricky to determine kind of who to actually ask. So we spent a bunch of time going between different groups and different people trying to figure it out. But in the end, the change had to happen either way. We still had that legal mandate. And we ended up actually taking our own advice here. And the advice I give to you before you schedule 12 meetings, just do it. Ask for forgiveness instead of permission. There are two outcomes from this. Either you do it and the person who is the stakeholder comes forward and you can actually have a conversation about what happened, or you do it and no one says anything and you've made the site more accessible and you can move on. And in our case, the latter is what happened. This same lesson applies to the larger team and priority level as well. As I've said, we kept kind of waiting for someone else to tell us accessibility was the priority. But we found much more success when we kind of decided that it was and put together our own proposal of how we could break down our team into the more traditional product-focused stuff we had been doing and then something more foundational. So we could really put resources against accessibility. And we outlined a roadmap that would get us to the end of this goal. This was in around December of 2019. And so we asked and said, hey, we're going to do this. And leadership was on board. I will say this is something that you can't do at every organization. Some organizations have a lot of red tape, a lot of different hierarchy you have to go through. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. Accessibility won't speak for itself. And the worst that anyone can do is say no. So you've got to ask and you've got to be that voice for accessibility. All right, we've made it to February of 2020 and we're back up and working at a pretty strong pace again. The major downside as we get back into this work is that we've taken this piecemeal approach for so long that we let slide a lot of the bigger, stickier problems. We figured, oh, once we have a team, once we have to, we'll figure it out. Here it is, we're at that time and we have to deal with the tech debt we've created within our own tech debt project. We quickly realized that even though our issue count was going down, we still had major blocks of work tied to what was just one or two issues in our auditor report. The biggest beast, and Jack has already alluded to it, was alt text for images. And you might say to yourself, it's just one metadata field. How hard could it be? All right. So let's remember that BuzzFeed has been producing content for 15 years. And you may notice if you visited the site that, boy, howdy, there are a lot of images on all of those posts, and none of them have that metadata. And behind the scenes at the time, the CMS that powered all of this content was some of the oldest part of the code base, a real pearl of an application, if you catch my drift. And it included image metadata fields spread across multiple tables, depending on where the image was used. Oh, and remember those 600 microservices? A lot of them also had their own tables, their own interfaces to be able to add this image metadata. And this is just for creating the interfaces to allow for the data to be entered. We aren't even talking about actually getting that data for all of the images that exist. And Jack and I thought, oh, well, maybe, we'll let the computer do it. We'll run it against some AI to see how things perform. So we grabbed images from the top, 30 or so posts, ran it against Vision API, and goodness, the results were really abysmal. BuzzFeed images include a lot of memes, a lot of stuff that's contextual and screenshots, and the image recognition misgendered people, misrecognized people, and in the case of some news images, made descriptions that were just actually offensive in the context. So we weren't going to be able to go that route. We had to ask an already overloaded editorial staff to start writing all of these image descriptions by hand. So as you can see, alt text was maybe a few issues in the list, but it could potentially be months more work to resolve it. This was what we realized the very, very long tail of the project. And this is a piece we could have kicked off way earlier. Jack had mentioned early on that the CMS team could potentially take this on. And through all of these different organizational changes, the CMS team was actually one of the most stable. So we could have talked to them and kicked this off when we were first starting and potentially been in a much better place by the time we had dedicated resources to work on some of the other accessibility parts, and also gotten more people to start writing alt text in the interim. So speaking of writing alt text, between trying to figure out some database migrations for code that had been in the industry longer than I had, and trying to get editorial on board with writing alt text, we were actually more nervous about getting people to write alt text. And this was a mistake because we assumed that our editorial staff wouldn't be empathetic to the cause of accessibility. In our minds, accessibility was just more work instead of a better way to make content understandable. We conducted some training sessions with editors and the leads in some of our major content groups, news, shopping, quizzes, to introduce them to the concept of alt text and how it impacts the understanding of their work by others who are reading the site with assistive technologies. As part of our training, we had our auditors come in, and our auditors at the time tested with a pair of a sighted and a blind user. The blind user came in and we sent him posts that the people who were in the room had written, very image heavy posts. And he slowed down his screen reader so that we could understand it. And he read through those posts and how terrible they sounded without the context of all of the images that were just missing. And the editorial team got it. It clicked like that. Finger snap. The importance of this initiative immediately connected with them in ways we had never expected. And overnight, we now had a new huge group of accessibility champions in our editorial space. We set up a dedicated Slack room for discussions around proper alternative content. And the discussions that came up could probably be the subject of their own separate talk. It ran into topics I hadn't even thought about. How do we deal with gender neutrality when we want to remain relatively gender neutral, but pictures and sizes are inherently gendered? And when is it important to denote a person's race when describing a photo based on sociopolitical context? Which again, this is the spring of 2020. That is a very important question. Hopping back to our timeline briefly to reiterate how much of a mistake this was. We were so blown away by how quickly editorial jumped in and realized we had missed a key opportunity to get cross-functional stakeholders who were interested and advocating for accessibility 2 years prior to where we actually did. Again, 2006, accessibility should have started. 2018, when we started this initiative, accessibility bringing an editorial really should have started. But we were in 2020, and that's when we finally added those folks into the mix. So now we've made it to the summer of 2020, and we have a rocket ship on the timeline because our major refactor has shipped. We put a lot of great new accessibility features out into the world, and we're coming up now on the 2-year anniversary of when these accessibility conversations started. But as we're finishing our final quotes, verification of issues, our auditors start to find some new ones in newly released features, including at least one directly introduced by Jack. I blamed him. I can be mad at him for like another year about that. And at this point, it's like, is this going to become the never-ending project? We were lucky to be able to catch up quickly as some of these new little fixes came in, but it brought to light that this entire time we had been thinking of accessibility as this mountain of issues. They dropped this huge mountain pile of issues, and we had just been trying to climb over, get over the mountain. But we never established base camp. We never really set up great training for developers. We never brought QA into the mix in a way that we really should have. We didn't set up a lot of linting in our existing pieces of code, only some of the newer, larger project. There are a lot of things we could have done to set ourselves up for success and not just keep making the mountain higher and higher and higher. And again, I haven't been outside in like a year, so my outdoors metaphors may be a little off. But the point is, accessibility is an active and shifting project. It's not a to-do list that you can just check off and be done with. And unfortunately, we were kind of treating it that way, which definitely backfired. And the curveballs kept coming towards the end of that project. in addition to those quote unquote final testing regressions, our auditors had let us know in mid to late June that there was a batch of about 40 issues that had actually been found earlier, but we had been so focused internally, we hadn't been in sync with them. And so suddenly we went from here's the last 3 things to clear that hurdle to get to that certification. It's right there. And suddenly the goalpost moves 40 feet down, 40 yards, football. And so seeing that open issues count almost get to 0 and then pop back up again it's painful. It hurts, especially since the teams that had been focused on the more dedicated accessibility pieces were now shifting to other projects, since we thought that we could make this more of a spread out cultural thing again. The sub mistake to this mistake is how we addressed it, which was I personally hunkered down and knocked out all 40 items in 1 week. This is not recommended for 2 reasons. 1, sleep, I have been told, is apparently beneficial to one's health. And 2, I took away learning opportunities from the rest of the team. These were issues that other folks had introduced, but I was just fixing them behind the scenes, which is the antithesis of what we wanted to create in our organization. We wanted to empower everyone to be able to recognize and fix accessibility issues. So do your best not to uncover surprises, and if you hit them, tackle them as a team. And here we are. We have made it to that last milestone in the timeline. Again, it's not the end, it's a checkpoint, because accessibility is not a one and done. But we made it over the hurdle that had loomed over us for 2 years and received a letter of conformance for BuzzFeed.com, the website, dated 10th July 2020. We made it with a lot of lessons to be learned to do better in the future. And I realize now we've spent the last 30-something minutes going on about everything we've done wrong. So you may be wary to trust us with advice on what to do for your own accessibility initiatives. But we did want to end on a high note and recognize that we did do some things right the first time, which are just as important to learn from and continue to do moving forward. First off, we didn't bring our editorial stakeholders in as early as we should. But once we did, we took the right approach in terms of letting the students become the teachers. Rather than Jack and I, in addition to trying to coordinate this huge technical, all of these different changes on the tech side, and then also trying to do all this editorial training, we gave the leads of the different groups the information they needed to go and train their teams. We relied on the Slack channels. We provided support, but we're not the primary teachers. And from there, the leads stepped in and guided their teams and created what was called kind of the alt text training perpetual motion machine, which allowed us to focus on the tech side.
This is Jack taking back over here. The level of investment we made in BuzzFeed's accessibility set a precedent. We build everything we make accessibly from the start, or we spend a lot of time and money fixing it all over again. What isn't an option is leaving accessibility out. Nobody at the company wants to go through a process from 0 like this again. So going forward, accessibility isn't a compromise. It isn't a feature. It isn't scope that can be cut out anymore. It's foundational. It's a given. Next slide. So our divide and conquer strategy had major drawbacks, but something I stand by is that it made sure that nearly every single person in BuzzFeed Tech was involved in some way or another in the effort to make our site accessible. When we announced we gotten the all clear for the site's accessibility, I included a list of the names of the people who made it happen, and it was enormous. Product managers made space for accessibility in every feature. Our front-end engineering team is now deeply knowledgeable about building accessible products. Our picture editors and staff across the editorial team are accessibility champions who push forward the standards of great accessible alternative content every single day. And I think that is what I'm most proud of from this project. And it makes me the most confident in the future of accessibility at BuzzFeed. And we'll take your questions.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. Hi, thanks, Plum, thanks, Jack. We have a lot of questions to go through, so I'm gonna start firing them off. The top one that everyone wanted to know about is, knowing what you know now, how will you convince leadership to take it more seriously, devoting resources and money?
You want to go first, Jack?
Yeah, I think my answer to this is nuanced, I think, because I still don't know whether I would advocate for an accessibility team off to the side that would do everything themselves in isolation from everyone else. Because I think, like I said, there were huge halo benefits of spreading that work across teams and connecting for people the accessibility implications of the feature and engineering decisions they make. So I don't know that I would advocate even now for an accessibility engineering team, but I think what I would do, knowing the scope of the issues that we were going to get back in that report, is advocate for a chunk in every team's roadmap that is devoted to accessibility, and also some of that cross-cutting foundational work, like that model we ended up with what I thought of as like Plum's front end, like accessibility infra team. Like I would have advocated for that off the top, because I think there was some infrastructural work that underpinned a lot of the accessibility fixes that needed to be tackled in a centralized way. How about you, Plum?
Yeah, I think accessibility is less of a we need one team for the to-do list of features, and more of a we need kind of this roadmap of accessibility and how it fits into all of the different places. So it's onboarding new people into accessibility, because you can do all the trainings you want, but every time you hire someone new, you have to make sure that they're kind of understanding the standards that we're building to. It's, as Jack said, creating that space in roadmaps, and it's having the subject matter experts and giving them the space to be able to consult with other teams and kind of set up that internal consulting model. And again, every organization is different. Some people have the space and the resources to be able to do it, and some of them have to be more scrappy. But the biggest thing is getting the empathy building. And a lot of that comes from, I think, the same method we used with our editorial team, which is showing real people encountering problems with products that we're proud of and seeing how they can fall flat on their face when we don't build in the right accessibility. And I think that's how you get the movement.
Great. Thank you for that. So another question that we have is, how do you deal with different priorities, such as new functionality versus accessibility?
It shouldn't be well, I guess if you have kind of a backlog, there's a kind of opportunity sizing and impact sizing of how many people are, basing off of statistics, off of your demographic, off of general, how many people are going to be blocked if something isn't accessible, what is considered a critical or a serious issue. And those are things you almost have to treat like a bug. You have to treat it like the site's down, because for a lot of people, the site is down. Yeah. And then for new features, as Jack said, accessibility is part of those new features. It's a minimum, it's a requirement. The same way, if the link had a typo and didn't work, if the link can't be highlighted, it doesn't work either way for some people. And you have to treat it like that, I think.
And how do you get the different teams to care about accessibility after you've completed the biggest chunk of work?
Yeah, this is a kind of major work stream for me at the moment. I think part of the picture is observability of this stuff. Like, I think there is an initial, what helps when you get an external audit is that you get a big piece of communication in one go about the situation, the problem, its importance, and the fact that it comes from outside, I think, weirdly helps this this kind of gravity. But it's much harder to maintain a kind of attention cycle over time, which is where these kind of regressions slip in. And part of making sure that people still care was this thing where it's like, this is work that you did on your team. Do you remember doing it? Do you have the pain still in your memory of fixing these bugs? You don't want to introduce new ones. And part of it is improving observability, like I said. So it's figuring out something better than just like accessibility lighthouse scores or like automated like ACE scores, some way where teams can see the kind of accessibility impact of the things that they're shipping over time. And that's something I'm working on with a few people at the moment. But I think what we saw from the project is that as soon as people see the impact of what begins as quite an abstract problem especially if they're not a user of assistive technology, once they see how it impacts an actual person, it's immediately like priority one in that moment. But it's maintaining that over time that is the real challenge, I think.
Awesome. What is your recommendation for an alternative to a piecemeal approach that still spread accessibility knowledge across the different teams to ensure new features don't continue to include accessibility issues?
I think you can do piecemeal, but you can do it in a more mindful way. We had been looking just by issue number count, and instead of kind of volume count or what the actual project was. And I think the better way to approach it is look at the kind of projects that are coming together and the size of the work. So instead of saying, oh, there's 3 tickets about alt text, so it's small, we think of, oh, there's 3 tickets about alt text, but alt text is actually a big problem. So we need to structure it and present it in that way. So it's creating, I think, a stronger roadmap versus just sort of throwing issues into the buckets and then letting other folks figure out what to do from there.
Awesome. We just got a question and related to that, actually. So someone posted, I work for a digital publishing company that is currently in the midst of climbing this mountain, and we're building our CMS and front end platforms. Did you also prioritize documenting best practices and creating an accessibility library or source of truth for anyone in the company to refer to?
Yes,
Plum,
I'm laughing.
You could speak best
yeah,
on this.
I'm laughing because anyone who's ever worked with me knows I'm the queen of documentation for everything. Yeah, so anything that you do, write down and share it. Anything about the practices you're using. On the code side, we use Storybook with the accessibility plugin so that we could see, both check our accessibility features against it. All of the different standards and talks that we did, we shared with everyone. And even now I'm at, a different company, but we're doing sort of accessibility trainings and things with onboarding and just making it a part of every single piece that we do. And we also periodically did internal tech talks at BuzzFeed on the accessibility project to remind leadership as well, to keep it kind of in everyone's minds. Here's what's going on. Here's why it's important. I think we've pulled the same slide deck out, Jack, maybe like 5 or 6 times that had a couple of slides about accessibility and the Microsoft Inclusive Design Kit, that one graphic showing the spectrum of disability all of the time. And I think that's the most important piece.
Yeah, that one graphic from Microsoft has done an incredible amount of work. I even saw it in a talk yesterday. It's a great piece of communication about kind of cross-cutting accessibility that we used a lot.
Awesome. Do you have any recommended resources about writing good alternative text?
So the situation that we ended up with at BuzzFeed was that we have specialized resources for our own editorial staff and voice, which I think is the place you want to get to, especially at like a big publishing organization that has its own voice. So I think there are great resources out there, and I'm sure we kicked off with some of those, but the place we're at now is that the editorial team have their own alt text guide that Plum started, but is always evolving with the kind of latest conclusions from their conversations about new pieces of content and new kinds of content and problems of presenting like visual information, because it's something that the editorial team are always playing with, and every kind of new situation they come up with visually, they have to come up with a new solution for with alt text. So it's like they're always trying to translate this BuzzFeed voice into alt text in a way that is kind of conformant with the best practices and BuzzFeedy. So it's a long way of saying like there's good resources out there that I'm sure Plum can point to, because she kicked off a lot of those docs for editorial, but like you eventually want to get to a place where you have your own version of those, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't have the links immediately on hand, but the W3C and the WCAG guidelines both point to some of their own examples within the resources that explain sort of different situations. But I definitely want to echo Jack in that alt text is part of the brand voice. And that's a really, it's images within text, especially in the body of text like BuzzFeed writes, are as much of the story as anything else. So it's very weird to be flipping between the, fun BuzzFeedy way of writing and then something very computerized or stoic. So you need to make it part of that. And I think BuzzFeed's continues to do a really good job doing that.
So on alt text again, how do you prioritize the order of adding alternative text to images? Most read pose, newest pose, oldest pose. What is the process?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, actually. And I think the solution that we ended up with was starting, like, there was a watermark moment where every new post came with alt text once enough people were trained. But also there was a kind of tranche of like really evergreen articles that we went back to add alt text to. So it's kind of like right now it's like the standard is everything gets it. And then we chose a tranche of articles that we needed to prioritize to fix up, but it's a constant process. So.
How do you onboard creative editorial folks? Developers tend to at least be familiar with the concept, in my experience, and are using testing and tools.
Yeah, so this is, again, a piece of work that's ongoing. But like Plum said about the perpetual motion machine, this is something that we trained them to train themselves to do. Like this is kind of like out of our hands now, and like the accessibility champions in editorial are experts in their own now, and they do this. But the way that it goes is it's just built into the picture editor training that people in editorial receive when they join. And we have check-ins. There's a colleague of mine, Tammy, who is a kind of bridge between us as the accessibility leads in tech and the accessibility leads in editorial. And we, try and provide extra guidance, or we provide access to some accessibility experts that we're in contact with to answer any particularly tricky questions. But the training is organized and run by editorial now, which is like a perfect situation, I think.
So here is another question. Can you give a few examples of good alternative texts?
It depends on what image you've got, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot about context. Interesting ones that we've come up with where the alt attribute might not necessarily be enough, and we had discussed sort of more complex markup formats for. BuzzFeed does a lot of sequential screenshots of clips from movie shows. So it'll be like a couple of different frames with text underneath each one. And that's a really challenging thing to write alt text for. There's kind of two approaches that I've seen, like from a single alt, because you don't want to write an entire novel in there. You could, in theory, just put all of the captions together, but you lose the visual of what people are doing because the motion can be important. The other option is to not necessarily take it verbatim, but describe what's happening. So there's a reason that sort of situation was placed there. So to give the description. I think the ideal situation would be either breaking those kind of mega joint images into smaller pieces and going one by one, or creating some sort of more infographic markup that lives behind the scenes and treating it as not just an image, treating it as a more complex picture that way. And Jack, I don't know if any other standards you've seen more recently.
Yeah, I think that's basically where we're at with it. There's a lot of kind of intermedium like picture types that are particularly difficult to manage. Infographics are a major one that is difficult, and like you say, eventually you just have to say like we have alternate content for this, because this isn't just like an image. It's a whole like piece of structured information that needs to be presented as such to assistive technology users.
And how has COVID impacted the process? With people craving more content, do you feel like you have more traffic as a result of your improvements as well?
There's a piece of yeah, sorry, go ahead, Plum.
No, I was going to say, because we had a lot of interesting sort of challenges in general around launching our refresh and understanding how, because we were also making, in addition to accessibility, we were making a lot of design and branding changes around the site at the same time. So it became very difficult to tease it out. And then on top of everything was happening during COVID, so we saw huge shifts in the types of posts people were looking at and also the volume. So I don't know if we'd ever be able to fully tease out the impact of one versus the other when we first launch. I don't know if it's more easy to tell now that some of the other pieces of the site have stabilized.
Yeah, I would say, like most things, like COVID ruined everything, including our observability of trends on the website. This is what one of the kind of major challenges is observability of the impact of accessibility conformance, and like from like the macro level to like, are people interacting with this quiz more who are keyboard users? Does that imply that we're allowing more users in who are like sole keyboard users and therefore being more inclusive of people? It's a very, very difficult thing to observe in a large scale way, and so it kind of just has to be built in as a, like, again, this is why it's kind of dodgy to make the growth and money argument around accessibility, because it's not something that you'll be able to prove out particularly easy, and it also shouldn't be why you're doing it. It's just a requirement.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. If you were to redo the accessibility audit, what preliminary actions would you do before starting this third-party evaluation?
That's a great question. I mean, like Jira springs to mind. Plum, like, what would your like migration solution be that you'd ask for?
I mean, and I've actually, in some of the talks yesterday, I've seen some solutions that were even better than things I could have thought of. So I would have, one, looked to people smarter than me for things that have been done before. Two, probably just established with the, like, when we're selecting vendors, establish up front what the options are, and see if it's something where, because ultimately work gets done when it's in a place. It goes back to observability. If work is in a place that people can see it and put it on their roadmaps, it gets done. So that's the major downside to third-party auditors having their own issue tracker systems. And honestly, in retrospect, I wonder if we should have just gotten the third-party vendor access to our system to input things directly into there in some way, so that we were all sort of using and speaking the same language. Either that, or empower more folks and delegate in terms of when you're making updates, introduce a process that also updates the ticket. Or we didn't share that knowledge as much because we were kind of worried about the logistics of getting more people onto the issue tracker. But in the end, we ended up with a bunch of logistical overhead anyway. So distributing it might have been a little less painful, at least for me.
I also think, like, any way that we could have used our vendor to help front load accessibility training. Like they've been a great resource to kind of help provide and enhance training with screen reader users and things. And I think something that we would have done, if we were kind of starting all over again, is try and use them to front load that accessibility training straight to designers and engineers, like before the report landed, way before the report landed,
Yes. Also QA. Our QA team at BuzzFeed is phenomenal, and they would have been so on board, and they were another group we looped in too late.
For sure.
All right. Thank you, Plum. Thank you, Jack, for this great session. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of XCon.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.